Good day. I'm back to continue my report about the Institutional Correction Module 2. So, Auburn System. So, we are in the example of Auburn System on the following topics. So, the prison and asylum, the Lowell System, the rule of the government, the economic nationalism, the slave labor, the corruption and reform, the Hayes to Harrison, manufacturing, the Jackson's appointment, and driverless, then the second party system, and the factor system. So next slide. So that's the example of the following topic that connected to Auburn system. So next slide. So the last step and the clothing. So Elam Blends and the association with the John D. Cray developed a revolutionary system transporting to convicts within the prison. So the prisoners march in unison and lock their arms to the convict in front of them. So the prisoner had to look to one side and were not allowed to look at guards or other inmates. The clothing at the prison was the grayish materials with the horizontal stripe. So next slide. So the punishment. So in the punishment in the over system prison was in 1821, a new principal keeper, the Elam Lenz, was appointed to run the prison. So he believed in the disciplinary power of the lash and used flogging to punish even minor infraction. So in 1839, a prisoner died from neglect and overflogging. So there are prisoner died by flogging. So the committee of this Auburn and the other staff members of the Auburn Theological Seminary petitioned to bring the issues of this punishment to the state government. So the law stated that 6 blows on the naked back with a cut or 6-stranded whip was the most punishment that could be assigned for one offense. So there are limit. So only 6-stranded whips that will be punished on a prisoner. So in 1846, another meeting was congregated to abolish the use of the whip. So flagellation could only be used for riots or severe cases. So because of this severe killing with the use of this whip, so they minimize the use of this flagellation. So they can only use this kind of punishment when there are a riot inside the prison. So when whipping was prohibited, guards and the keepers sought new ways to punish the disorderly. So the shower bath consisted of a barrel about 4.5 feet high with a discharge tube at the bottom. So the prisoner was stripped naked, bound hand and foot with a wooden collar around his neck. So to prevent him moving his head, the barrel with the inmate inside was placed directly under an outlet pipe where water, sometimes iced, would pipe pour down. So another form of punishment was the yoke. The yoke used iron bars around the neck and arms of the prisoner. So next slide. So the woman and the prison. So in the early days of the prison, women inmates were held in the windowless attic atop of a high security prison. So the women prisoners must stay in the windowless. So there are no window. They shared a single room and slept in the same area where they worked primarily at picking wool, knitting, and spooling. So in 1838, all women prisoners were transferred to the then new female wing at the Sing Sing. So in 1892, the woman returned to a new building at the Auburn prison. So the Auburn Women's Prison remained in operation until 1933. So when a new maximum security wing for female inmates opened at the Bedford Hills. So next slide. So by the early 1820s, the Auburn Plan had resulted in the construction of 30 individual cells and the workshops, as well as rigid system of the enforced silence and the harsh punishment. So each entering convict was assigned a prison number which served as his or her identity. So movements to and from the workshops was performed in a regimented manner, so known as the lockstep, so which called for a prisoner to march in a military style human chain. So a Boston clergyman who visited Auburn in 1826 found it a shining example of what could be accomplished with a proper discipline and design. So the Auburn system are also pursuing to develop the discipline of one's offender. So the wall establishment from the gate to the sewer is a specimen of neatness. So he wrote that the unremitted industry, the entire subordinates, and the subdued feeling of the convicts have probably no parallel among the unequal number of criminals. So the Reverend Lewis Dwight and his associates from the Boston Prison Discipline Society pronounced Auburn a noble institution and said, so we regard as a model of worthy of the word's imitation. So that's according to Lewis Dwight. So the institution seems so successful that in 1825 Linz was assigned to build a similar prison in Sing Sing. So the next topic is the Pennsylvania system. So what is Pennsylvania system? So what is the different from Auburn? What is it's different from the Auburn system? So we will all know that. We will know everything in our next slide. Next slide. So the evolution of the American prison labor is rooted in the Commonwealth of the Pennsylvania. So the Pennsylvania penal system originating in 1682. So under the leadership of William Penn. So was the first state prison system to suggest the replacement of torture and mutilation as punishment of crimes with a hard labor in houses of correction. So Penn's intentions were not systematically executed when his penal code of 1682 was repealed. So as a result, labor in penal institution was practically non-existent in the Pennsylvania during the colonial period. So however, Penn's efforts were not futile, as the penal code altered in 1682 so left a mark on the laws of the Pennsylvania and the evolution of prison labor across the nation. So next slide. So in 1773, the Walnut Street Jail was constructed in Philadelphia. So during the early years of the Walnut Street Jail, Penn's order to establish workhouses was revived. So the Constitution of 1776 directed the enactment of the law establishing houses of correction for punishing by hard labor. So those who shall be convicted of crimes not capital. So the legal force was added to the provision of the Constitution by the law of 1786. So which ordered the punishment of the prisoners by the continued hard labor. So they publicly and disgracefully imposed. So this act provided the prisoners were to be employed in the workhouses and in the repairing and cleaning of the street and the highways. So the assumptions of this time period was that idleness was the deteriorating force and that hard work should be used as a punishment and the discipline. So during the early years of the Walnut Street Jail, the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prison, known today as the Pennsylvania Prison Society. So today, was reformed to improve so the revolting conditions that existed in the penal facilities. So more specifically, the prison society targeted the manner in which Walnut Street jail inmates were placed on the public display as they clean city street. So they are pursuing to have they are pursuing that the offenders should acquire manners. So as a result, the public labor of prison inmates was abolished. So those punishments have been abolished. So the prison society called for separate solitary confinement and the labor with the construction in labor morals and religion. So work was not to be punishment but to be used as the agent of the reform. Next slide. So from the first state prison system implemented several innovation ideas in the management and the rehabilitation of the criminals, so including the expanded and the successful prison industry. So from 1790 through the late 1820s, the most common occupations were nail making, show making, stone sewing, weaving, and picking, carving wool in hair. So inmates also made their own clothing. So the industrial and the commercial organization of this period was conducted according to the piece price form of the contract system. So under this system, contractor supplied the raw materials and paid the state an agreed amount for work done on each piece of article, so manufactures by the inmates. So gradually, however, these industries become unproductive and disordered as the Walnut Street should become overcrowded due to the influx of the prisoners from across the state. So the capacity of the facility was congested. So inmates sentenced to the solitary confinement with the hard labor were put in the congregate department of the prison and double cells. So this hard labor had been back because of this overpopulated in a prison. So this lead to a smaller percentage of the inmates productively employed in a general breakdown of the disciplinary system, as the communication among inmates could no longer be restrained. So internal affair of the Walnut Street prison alarm in the public. So next slide. So internal prison reformists focus on determining the causes of criminality. So the roots of crime were thought to be found in the inadequate training in school and in church. So Pennsylvania response to this penal philosophy was the construction of two state penitentiaries designed to rehabilitate offenders with the focus of the inmate employment. So in 1827, the West the West State Penitentiary. So in 1827, the Western State Penitentiary was built in the Allegheny Country. In 1829, the Eastern State Penitentiary was built outside the Philadelphia. The Act of 23 of 1829, so enacted through the influence of the Pennsylvania Prison Society, so ordered that the fundamental program of penal administration at both facilities be solitary confinement at hard labor. So this solitary system of prison labor failed at the Western Penitentiary. So due to the small cells which lack adequate air and light, making solitary work impossible. So instead, labor at Western Penitentiary was conducted in common congregate workshop. and the system of solitary confinement was abandoned. So in fact, in Act of 1869 allowed the desired congregation of prisoners for the industrial purposes, and by 1873 the congregate shop system was installed at the Western Penitentiary. So during this time, the Western developed a diversified industrial program where the production of shoes, the cocoa nuts, nursery, and brooms continue into the 20th century. So prison administration at the Eastern Penitentiary and the in the prison administration at the Eastern Penitentiary, on the other hand, was successfully implementing the system of the solitary confinement with the hard labor. So in fact, this Eastern became the national model for the separate system, where inmates were confined to their cells to work under the supervision of the correctional officials. So they were forced to comply with the work demands in an effort to instill the self-discipline and healthy work habits into their characteristic. Just what I've said earlier, they pursue the offenders should acquire this discipline. So the industries were of the simple, elementary nature, so they could be managed within the confines of a single cell using the handicraft method. So because of this, the weaving and the shoemaking were the chief industries at Eastern, and a few inmates were employed dyeing clothes and the picking of wool in the isolation of the separate cell. So around the time of the separate system was developed in the Pennsylvania, New York, introduced the congregate system. So at the Auburn State Prison, where inmates work together in a common workshop. So the opponents of this Pennsylvania separate system criticized that we'd use power machinery, and they therefore were not as the productive. So the opponents of New York's congregate system insisted that guards had to be more highly skilled and trained in order to supervise the congregate workshops. So although this system were different, both emphasized rehabilitation through the steady routine and labor eventually. So however, the separate system and its associated concept of solitary labor were abandoned, and the Pennsylvania and separate confinement at the hard labor had become the practically non-existent by the end of the Civil War in 1865. So the additional information. So the Pennsylvania this separate system is a form of the prison management based on the principle of keeping prisoners in the solitary confinement. So when first introduced in the early 19th century, the objective of such a prisons or this penitentiary was that of the penance by the prisoners through silent reflection upon their crimes and behavior as much as that of the prison security. So next slide. So more commonly, however, the term separate system is used to refer at the specific type of prisons architect built to support such system. So the state of this Pennsylvania was the first to take steps and initiate a newer system at the as well. So prison maintenance. So the goal were aimed at the development of more humane processes and practices that entailed dealing with the criminals. So there were crimes that were once bringing death and torture as penalties now brought prison sentence instead. So it is the line with this suggestion that the Pennsylvania system came about. So the founding reason for the two penitentiaries operations such as the Auburn and the Pennsylvania system were similar to the operation at the Walnut Street prison. So the leading operation included emphasizing the opportunities for the prisoners to reform themselves. So the reformation would be instilled through hard work and at the same time reflecting on the crimes that this individual had committed. So this particular operation would then be referred to as this Pennsylvania system. Next slide. So, and the Pennsylvania prison system, or as well as referred as the separate, and the Auburn system as the silent system, the offenders and the criminals were not morally contaminated, and they would be trained on how to commit crime by the other prisoners. So, while at the same time keeping those who are deemed as the offenders separate and silent. So, this system seems as to be one of the most efficient approaches, though the still existent error here and this. So one of the main issues with this Pennsylvania prison system was the point that as a system, the Pennsylvania system was the point that as a system it was taking a huge quantity of stuff so as to be able to keep the offenders away from the mingling with the rest, and because the offenders were the ones who were producing goods individually, those making the production cost and rates a lot more of lower. Remember, Pennsylvania system is also known as the separate system, while Auburn system was also known as the silent system. That's all.